editor of QuorumReport.com, our good friend Scott Braddock. Scott, good morning. How are you today?
Doing well, Chad. How are you?
Doing great. Appreciate you joining us this morning. There's at least a little bit making news in the state of Texas.
A lot going on, and you look around at the fact that you've had protests that are starting to die down now. The COVID-19 numbers starting to pick back up again. And then big Supreme Court rulings that, of course, will affect everybody in Texas and across the country. Where would you like to start?
I guess, if you can bring us up to speed with what happened with the Supreme Court today, feel free to do that.
Well, they're looking at several things today. This is one of those ruling days where every 10 minutes they drop another one of these major cases. And the big one that just came down from the Supreme Court has to do with the rights of gay and transgender individuals. They ruled that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 does protect gay and transgender workers from workplace discrimination. Essentially, they said that if somebody was fired because they believed that it was because they were gay, then they do have the right to sue for bias. And in this case, Chad, we're used to the court being very divided and usually ruling, 5-4 on things just by a one-vote majority, but this was a 6-3 ruling with you had Neil Gorsuch, who is one of the more conservative members, who went with the liberal bloc on this, along with Chief Justice Roberts, in saying that it should be legal, for these folks to be able to sue for bias if they feel that they were discriminated against because they're gay and or transgender, and of course you have the LGBTQ groups already just exploding on social media and saying, this is a huge victory for civil rights. And then on the other side, the other side's been a little more quiet about this so far. We'll see what the reaction is the rest of the day.
Yeah. Okay. Let's get into some statements. Yeah, definitely. I would say probably the most interesting part of that would be Neil Gorsuch voting with the majority on that one. That would probably surprise a lot of people. But again, I haven't seen his opinion yet or anything like that. But just we'll see if the Trumpster tweets anything a little bit later.
Yes, that's one of the things to watch. I do think that the Supreme Court is fascinating because it has, over the last couple of decades, for sure, become more and more of a partisan branch of government, which, of course, a lot of folks think is just unfortunate. The court is supposed to be the branch of government that's the most divorced from politics and the political winds of the day. This is one of those cases that proves that maybe it is. Somebody like Gorsuch goes in there and is expected to be one of the more conservative voices on the court, and in this case, certainly asserted what would at least be an independent voice on an issue.
Let's see, the governor, you brought it up earlier, we're seeing coronavirus numbers spike, which I think is expected since the state's reopening. What is the governor saying about the spike? Is he concerned? Is he not concerned? Are we doing okay on hospital beds? What's going on there?
Well, over the weekend, we did reach one of those milestones, and we keep hitting various milestones, mile markers in this pandemic. Texas had never had more people in the hospital for COVID-19 than it did over the weekend, with about 2,287 hospitalizations in Texas. As of yesterday, that would be the sixth day out of 7, we've set a new high for hospitalizations in Texas. We right now have about 14,000 available hospital beds and about 5,800, almost 6,000 ventilators available. The governor was interviewed on Fox 7 television here in Austin over the weekend. He was asked if he was concerned about that. He said that no, he really isn't, because there is plenty of hospital capacity. And Chad, the whole idea, as you remember, with quote-unquote flattening the curve earlier in the year with everybody staying home, people not being allowed to go to work and staying away from each other, basically on lockdown for at least about 6 weeks there. The whole idea was that the hospitals would be able to ramp up their capacity. And we had talked here on the show about the idea that if only flattening the curve is what you do, if you only have the lockdowns and you don't do anything else, then all you're really doing is moving back the dates at which people become infected
and
at which they die. But that has to, you have to do other things too. And while the curve was being flattened, the hospital systems around the state were ramping up their capacity to be able to deal with this. And the coverage, of course, for being able to deal with it's going to be uneven. I mean, there's not going to be as many hospital beds in Lubbock, for example, or in the Panhandle as there are in Houston or Dallas or San Antonio or Austin. So those places where they've had, bigger spikes, it looks like for now they're able to handle it. But you do have some local leadership, the Harris County Judge, Lena Hidalgo, for example, who is saying that maybe they need to go a little further and move back toward, mandatory masks and things like that. Also, the county judge in Bexar County in San Antonio, Nelson Wolf, had said something similar. But Governor Abbott says he disagrees with that and that it's up to individuals, and he says it's all about personal responsibility.
Okay, correct me if I'm wrong here. We've got Tahoka, which is in this area, Scott, that last week said we're going on a lockdown. We're going on lockdown. Restaurants cannot open. They can do carry out only. This was last week that Tahoka announced this, and I had posted on Twitter. Wait a minute, I think this runs up against what the governor has said, right? I mean, local communities, as of right now, cannot go back and shut down their cities, can they not?
As I understand it, and as the governor has asserted his authority here, which, by the way, Chad, is some uncharted territory, the governor has said in one of his executive orders that he issued previously that essentially the short version is that the state is in charge of all this at this point. He has suspended the authority of mayors and county judges to be able to deal with these sorts of catastrophes, and that he's taking it all upon himself as governor to deal with it. That hasn't been challenged in court. Maybe if some of these communities want to go ahead and challenge him on that, they will end up in court. We'll see, and that might actually provide some clarity. You did have the governor and the big county judges going back and forth about which businesses could be deemed to be essential and non-essential, whether or not there would have to be mandatory masks or not, and all of that. And right now, it's basically just that the governor has said that he has the authority to call those shots and that the local officials don't have that authority. I do know that there are some frustrated legislators, Chad, who think that maybe the governor shouldn't be able to have these disaster powers for such a long period of time. When the Disaster the Disaster Powers Act was passed years ago, it was not thought that the governor would have this sort of sweeping authority for such a long period of time. Obviously, and this gets into separation of powers, but you have the governor or the executive, so you have the governor or the president, who should be able to act quickly when there is some sort of an emergency, right? That's why you have an executive. You can't get all 181 members of the legislature together that quickly to deal with something that maybe needs a quick response within 24 hours. But there is some thought, even among Republicans, and especially among Republicans, that maybe the governor should have to answer to them at some point. Maybe there should have to be a special session where they sign off on whatever he's doing. As you know, he's taken criticism from both the left, who says he's opening things up too quickly, and the right, who said that, a lot of folks on that side said he was going way too slow. Yeah. And so, maybe after 60 days or 90 days, the governor would have to go to lawmakers and say, basically, is what I'm doing okay? And they would even, either give him the thumbs up or thumbs down. And I think, Chad, that's going to be one of the big points of contention during the next legislative session come January, when policymakers, lawmakers get together here in Austin. Yeah.
Let's see, is the state capitol still closed?
Yes, sir. And, in fact, it's closed today even to members of the legislature and their staff. We had reported yesterday at quorumreport.com that two more individuals, two more DPS state troopers who are assigned to the Texas Capitol for security, had come down with COVID-19. That diagnosis we learned about yesterday afternoon. And the State Preservation Board, the folks who maintain the Capitol, are doing a deep cleaning of the building today because these cases were discovered. And apparently there was also, I'm just looking at my notes now, Chad, apparently there was also a case of a person who contracted COVID-19, had been diagnosed positive in the Legislative Council office, which is in a different building at the Capitol complex. The Ledge Council, they're the ones who actually, those are the lawyers who actually write the bills. When when a lawmaker comes in and says, hey, I've got a great idea, those are the lawyers who actually put together the language of how it would actually work if it was a state statute. Their office also closed, apparently today, because of the same thing. They at least had one case over there. So right now the Capitol is closed. Governor's Mansion is closed. The entire Capitol grounds has been closed after the protests a couple of weeks ago, where some of the protesters, as you saw online and we talked about here, had vandalized part of the building and had ripped up some of the historic things that are there, including an old water fountain. I think it's about a 200-year-old fountain. That got ripped up by some of these protesters. So the whole complex is still shut down. You have the Texas House and Texas Senate not meeting, not even remotely. Some of the staffers at the Capitol have grumbled and wondered why they're not having hearings, saying, I guess a Zoom meeting would be too difficult. There had been some security concerns raised about different streaming options for hearings. But the Texas Supreme Court has met via Zoom. And so while businesses are opening up all over Texas, state government, in large part, at least to the public, still shut down.
Well, maybe that means they're non-essential.
I had heard some folks say that that they ought to lead by example.
I'll get some text messages on that one.
You will get some. You'll get some text messages. I can guess probably who some of them might come from, but yeah, lead by example. If they're going to open everything up, if everything is safe, and this is some of the criticism I saw over the last 24 hours, if it's safe for everybody to go back to businesses, and whichever businesses they want to go to, retail or restaurants or whatever, if that's safe, then the governor ought to say, hey, Texans can come on into the Capitol again, maybe on some limited basis. Maybe they can go into the governor's mansion for tours again. If business is open, government should be open. And of course, there's also the criticism that you do have the Supreme Court that says that folks can't have expanded access to mail-in ballots because people might catch COVID-19, might catch coronavirus. But the Supreme Court themselves met on Zoom to make that decision, of course, because of concerns about catching coronavirus.
Real quick, you had mentioned that you looked into different polling data on pot, on legalized pot, as a possible revenue source for the upcoming legislative session. It's
pretty interesting. Chairman Burrows last week from there in Lubbock, Dustin Burrows, held a little seminar on Facebook, and he was talking about alternate revenue streams to try to contain property taxes. Of course, Chad, even though lawmakers fixed property taxes last legislative session, what are we still arguing about? Property taxes being too high. So they're trying to figure out ways to fix it. One of the things that he mentioned, and he went out of his way to say that it was an idea from a Democrat, Joe Moody from El Paso.
Right.
And by the way, Burrows said that he wouldn't be able to support it himself, but he said you had to put all the different items on the table if you're going to have a complete list. And so he talked about marijuana, he talked about casino gambling and some other things. Some private polling I've seen suggests that among primary voters in Texas who are Republicans, it's kind of a mixed bag. I think a lot of people think immediately that Republicans are against pot, but as you know, the Republican Party of Texas platform says that there should be at least decriminalization of marijuana, that we shouldn't be punishing people, for something that is something they're using maybe at home but not hurting anybody else. But the private polling that I saw, there was broad support for full medical marijuana among Republican primary voters. 70% agreed that there should be medical marijuana. For recreational, it was lower, though, about 30%. And I think it depends on where you are, Chad, geographically in the state. I think in some suburbs you would probably see Republican voters who are more open to recreational pot, and I think in the rural areas they're probably against it.
Yeah. Interesting. If there's going to be a session where it goes through, this is probably, I don't think it would go through, but I think this is one where there's probably going to be more discussion on it.
Certainly more discussion. Democrats are basically all for it. In the Republican Party, there's a debate, as we mentioned, and what Representative Moody from El Paso had suggested was maybe they could just do a constitutional amendment and let Texans vote on that. Yeah. Of course, the way that works is that two-thirds of the House and Senate would have to agree to send something to voters, and then it's an up or down vote. If a majority agrees that November, then it happens. And, if you had enough Republicans, since there is a debate within the party, then you might be able to see some movement on this. And in a tough budget situation, Chad, again, everything's going to be on the table.
Yeah. All right, Scott. We can talk more about that later as we get closer to the session.
It's going to be a big topic.
Yeah, I think that will be, and a few other things too. Scott, tell folks what they can find at Quorum Report.
We are only a month away from the runoff, Chad. July 14th is when the next voting happens in Texas. By the way, today is the day you need to be registered to vote. Make sure to take care of that if people want to participate in the July 14th runoffs. And the fact that we're 30 days out also means we're starting to look at the finance reports for candidates all across the state who are still on the ballot. And we'll get that together for you and report it out at quorumreport.com, where we would love to have you as a subscriber. Go to quorumreport.com, click subscriptions.
All right, Scott, as always, appreciate your time. We'll let you get back to work, and we'll visit with you next week.
Thanks, Chad. Talk soon.
That's Scott Braddock, editor of quorumreport.com here on the Chad Hasty Show.